A lot of you tell me you'd like to gamify your e-learning, but you feel that time is an issue. You don't have the luxury of spending weeks to build complex games. But you don't need to create full-blown games to gamify your training, and one of the ways that I save time and still manage to keep learners engaged is by having a library of game ingredients that are already built in Storyline and ready to go. Now, these are not templates. If you want your training to work, it's always better to build custom e-learning tailored to your specific learning objectives, but there are certain little ingredients that I find myself using again and again. So today I'm going to show you 5 common game ingredients that you can pre-build in Storyline so that you have them on hand when you need them. But before we begin, hi, my name is Mary Jo, and on this channel I show you how to use game mechanics to make your e-learning as effective as possible. And if learner engagement is something that you're struggling with, you can check out my program, The Effective Gamification Framework, at the link below. And now let's dive into these 5 reusable game ingredients that can transform your e-learning while saving you time. First up, we have the interactive gauge. This is something you can use in your early levels to help learners figure things out for themselves. For example, let's say I'm teaching the learner the correct angle to trim a tree. I can tell them this is wrong, and this is right. But in this activity, I'm asking them to guess the angle, and as they're playing with it, this gauge is showing them how close they are to the right answer. As they get closer to it, the gauge fills up until it's perfect. In later lessons, I can remove the gauge altogether and see if they remember the correct angle without the help. The point of this is just to let them discover the correct angle for themselves actively instead of me telling them the answer. So here's how I built that. So to create this gauge, I'm going to start by just creating a simple line, which I'm going to make nice and thick. So let's give it a width of maybe 12. And I'm also going to make it white and make it dashed. Next, what I want to do is go to Insert Dial, but I'm not going to use one of the built-in dials. I'm going to convert this to a dial. So now I can move this line as part of a dial, but as you can see, it's not moving correctly. I want it to move from the bottom, so I'm going to take the anchor point over here and just move it down to the bottom. Now I can move it the way I want it. And I'm just going to reposition it a little bit so that it's moving perfectly. And that's a nice range of possibilities for my learner. The next thing I want to do is make it so that there's not only 12 possibilities, but I want all 180 possibilities. So 180 degrees here. So now it goes from 0 to 180, and the initial value we'll put at 90. So when the game starts, it's going to be nice and vertical here. And as you can see, whenever I'm moving this dial, the variable line 1 is the one that's going to change, but I want to change that to have a name like angle. So now the line 1 variable has been changed to angle. And to make sure that it works, I'm just going to create a shape here, and I'm going to put in my variable. And if I test this, I can see that the angle is changing whenever I move this dial. Perfect. The next thing I'm going to do is create the gauge itself. So let's create a rectangle, and we'll make 2 of them, 2 identical rectangles. So you can't see it very well right now, but there's 2 of them. I'm going to make one of them pink, and the other one is white. And let's make sure that they're right on top of each other. And I'm also going to create a little box so we can see it a little bit better. Put this box behind my 2 rectangles and give it a wooden texture. And I'm going to write angle here. So this top rectangle is the one that's going to get bigger or smaller based on how well I'm doing. So this is the rectangle that's going to be my gauge. Let's call it gauge. And I'm going to give it 6 different states. So it's going to have a state when it's at 0. So when I'm really, really far off, it's just, there's not going to be a gauge. There's going to be one that's 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 100. So when it's at 100, it's going to be full width. So right now its width is 568. So 80% of that width is 454. Yes, I calculated that offline. 341 for 60%, 228, 114, and 0 for 0. All right, and also what I want to do is that when it's at 100%, I want it to be a nice green, and I want to write perfect. Now the next thing I need to do is to come up with a scoring scheme. So I'm going to start with my perfect score, which is 45 degrees. And let's say they're going to get 100% of the points if they're between 42 and 48. So a little margin for error. And that's when the gauge is going to be full. Yay! And as they get farther and farther out, the gauge is going to be at 80%, 60%, 40%, And when they're really far out, they're going to be at 0. The gauge is empty. So now that I have my scoring scheme, all I have to do is program those numbers into my gauge in Storyline. So change the state of my gauge, set it to 100% when the angle changes. If the angle is between, we said, 42 and 48. Set it to 80% when the angle changes. If the angle is between 49 and 60, or if the angle is between 30 and 41. Make sure that's an OR, and now we do the same thing for 60, 40, 20, and 0. And because the dial is starting at the position 90, then that means that the gauge should start out at 60 because I'm at 90 here. So let's give that an initial state of 60. Now let's see if that works. So the gauge is shrinking because I'm getting farther and farther out from the right answer, and now it's growing all the way until perfect, and then it starts to lose again. Now I just need to remove this, and that's how you build an interactive gauge. Again, I'd use this in early levels to let them discover things for themselves, and then take the gauge away later when I want to assess them. Next up, we have the hint system. I've said it before, when training is not engaging, most of the time it's because it's not at the right level of difficulty for the learner. And most of the time it's too easy because we want to make sure that everyone passes. That's where a hint system can really be helpful to you. So here I'm training the learner on how to properly fill out this form, and I've made it pretty challenging because if they're ever stuck, they can have access to a hint here. When you click on a hint, you'll get a hint that's specific to what you're doing in this particular moment. But you're also losing a point every time you take a hint, so you have to be mindful of that. If you don't get the passing score, you can retry with another scenario, and if you do get a passing score, you can still try to get it perfectly without any hints. That way it's challenging enough to be interesting to my more advanced learners, but I'm not leaving any newbies behind because they have this optional support as well. I'm empowering the learners to decide if and when they need a hint. In this particular scenario, the more hints they use, the lower their score, but they can replay to try and get it perfectly without any hints. So here's how I built that. So the way this works is I've got a different slide for each of my fields based on what the learner is working on at that particular moment. So all of these slides are working off the same slide master, and to create my hint system, I start by creating a hint layer here. On this hint layer, I'm going to have a shape where I'm going to put hint text here, and that's a variable that I'm going to have to create. So hint text, and it's a text variable. I'm going to make this shape fly in from right, and I'm going to make it transparent. Then on the base layer here, I'm going to create a hotspot, and whenever the user clicks on that, we're going to show the layer hint. And on my layer hint, I'm going to reduce the score by 1. So every time I use a hint, I'm going to take the score and I'm going to subtract 1 from it when the timeline starts on this layer. And now I can get out of the master. On each of these slides, I want the text to be different, the hint text to be different based on what the learner is working on. So for this first one, they're going to be working on park. So I'm going to set the hint text to the first national park in the US. That's going to give me the hint to Yellowstone. So now I just have to copy this trigger onto each of the other slides. So this next slide is where they'll be working on the project field. So the hint there will be specific to that. And I just keep doing that for all of my slides, each of which represents one of these fields. Now, if we test this entire scene, I see that my first hint is related to the park field, and as I'm working through each field on my form, the hint is changing and my score is going down every time I hit hint. So that's how I built this hint system. Next up, we have the countdown timer. This one's a classic, and for good reason. Like I just said, the right difficulty level is crucial to making an activity engaging, and a countdown timer is a super easy way to make an activity harder or easier just by playing with the amount of time you're giving the learner. Now, I know some of you will argue that timers aren't accessible for all learners, but the thing is, some real-world tasks do require speed, whether it's medical triage or just identifying a bird before it flies away. So if your real-world context involves quick reflexes or quick recall, then a timer can be absolutely essential to helping learners build that speed. So here's a quick way to make a timer. So right now I've got a very simple activity where I have to identify the national park, and I'd like to add a timer to this activity. So all of these 10 questions are all using the same master, and that's where the score is sitting right now. And because I want the timer to apply to all of these questions, I'm going to build the timer on the slide master itself. So the first thing I want to do is create a timer variable. So let's call it timer, and it's a number variable. And then I'm going to create a box so that we can display the time left. So this is going to be displaying the value of my timer variable, and let's give that variable a default value of 60. Next, I want to create a countdown layer, and I'm going to make it last exactly 1 second. And at the end of that 1 second, I want it to subtract 1 from the timer. So adjust variable timer, subtract 1 when the timeline ends. So at the end of that 1 second. Then what I want it to do is to hide this layer and then show this layer. So what's going to happen is this layer waits 1 second, subtracts the timer, goes away and comes back again, and it starts over and over again. Pro tip, if you don't want your timer to keep going down, 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 even past 0 into the negative numbers, what you need to do is to add a condition here. So subtract value 1 from the timer if the timer is greater than 0. So if it's at or less than 0, it's going to stop doing that. And then what we want to do is we want to display this layer the first time when the timeline starts. Okay, so let's see how that works using all of my slides. So I'm going to preview this entire scene. So I've got the timer going down now, and when I jump to another question, it keeps going because it's using that same variable all the way through all the questions. And that's it. That's all you need to do to build a countdown timer. Next up is the % progress bar. Now I know most of you are familiar with progress bars. They're a great way to let the learner know where they are with respect to the goal and to boost their motivation to move forward. The problem is this. Let's say I've got this quiz here with 5 questions. So my max score is 5. And when my score changes, the state of the bar changes because I've got a progress bar here with 6 states. Great. But let's say in my next module, I've got 13 questions. I can't reuse my progress bar here because it only goes up to 5. So here I have to make a whole new score bar that's split into 13 different states this time. And if my next activity has 63 questions, well, I'm screwed. So that's why I use % progress bars. Every time the score changes, my bar converts it to a percentage and displays that. So if I have a score of 12 out of 16, this bar will calculate the percentage, 75, and display that. But if it's 12 out of 63, then the same bar will show 19%. And here's how to build that. So the first thing we're going to do is create a progress bar that has a different state for each 5% increment. So 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, all the way up to 100. So let's do that. And right now they're all identical, so I have to change the width of most of these. So the full width is 637. So I'm gonna have to calculate 5% of 637, then 10% of this, etc. And in order to do that, I'm gonna go to my trusty Excel. So I've got the full width here, 100%, and all the percentages. So all I have to do is for each state, change the width to that. So for 5%, the width should be 32, and for 10%, it should be 64, and so on and so forth, all the way up to 100. So that's going to take a few minutes. And now that that's done, the next thing I want to do is create a variable called score%, which is a number variable. And I'm immediately going to create a whole bunch of triggers to set the correct state of this score bar. So change the state of the score bar when the variable changes score%. So when score% changes, we want to set the score bar to the right level. So if the score% is 0, I want to set the state of the bar to 0. If it's greater or equal to 5, then I want the bar to be 5. And if it's greater or equal to 10, then make it 10, and so on, all the way up to 100. And when you get to 100, you want to use an equal sign, obviously, because we're not going to go over 100. Okay. So now whenever the score% changes, this bar is going to change. But every time I get a question right, it's my score that's going up. It's not my score%. So every time the score changes, we have to convert this score to a new percentage. And here's how we do that. First off, when the quiz begins, I set my max score. In this case, it's 13, and that's not going to change at any point during the quiz. I also am going to need a new number variable called temp score. because whenever the learner gets a new question correct and the score changes, we're going to make a whole bunch of calculations using the score, but I don't want those calculations to change my score. If the score is 5, then it has to stay 5 until the learner gets a new question right. That's why I have temp score. It's just a copy of the score that I'm going to use for the calculations so that I'm keeping my score intact. So we start by copying the temp score equal to score. So let's say my score is 5, the temp score is going to be 5. Next, I'm going to take that temp score and divide it by the max score. So 5 divided by 13 gives me 0.38. That's my new temp score. Then I multiply that by 100, so now it's 38. And then I can set my new score percent variable to that new value. Set score percent to variable temp score. So every time my score changes, this all is going to fire, and that's going to convert the score to a new score percent. Now, as soon as I change that score percent, we know that that's going to trigger the score bar to update itself. So if it's 38, then it's going to be above 35, but not above 40. So the bar is going to end up in this state here of 35%. And before I test this, I also need to make sure that the score bar starts out empty. So initial state is going to be 0. And if we test that, you'll see that we're missing something. The score bar is updating, but then it's going back to 0 every time. And that's because we're jumping to a different slide after every question, so the score bar is always going back to its initial state of 0. To fix that, I need to copy all of these triggers and make them also happen at the beginning of each slide. So I copy all of these triggers, and now I just need to change the condition to when timeline starts. And I do that for each one. I know this is tedious, but you're only going to have to do this once, and then you can reuse this score bar. So now these triggers are going to fire every time the timeline starts and also whenever the score percent changes. And now when I test it, it works perfectly. I know this is a lot of triggers, but the beauty of this is that I only have to do this once, and then I can copy it over to other storyline programs. So it's a bit of short-term pain for long-term gain. And finally, we have the dice roll. A little bit of randomness can bring a ton of benefits to training, like making sure that repetitive practice feels fresh, or mimicking the variability that exists in the real world so that your simulations are more accurate, etc. I've got a whole video about it if you're interested. And dice are a classic way to represent randomness in your training game, so let's see how to build one in storyline. Here's an example where I just click on the die and that makes it roll and generate a number. So to build this, I'm first going to insert a die illustration. So if you search for dice in the content library, you'll find this. This die will have 6 different states, 1 through 6. So let's create those 6 different states. And I can find each of those states in the content library. And I'm going to call that moving die. Then I'm going to create a new variable called die roll, which is a number. And when the user clicks on the die, I'm going to set the variable die roll to a random number between 1 and 6. Next, when the die roll variable changes, that is when I click on this die, we're going to make that moving die change to the new number. So set moving die to 1 when die roll changes if die roll is equal to 1. And then I repeat that for the other 5 possibilities. So let's test that. Okay, so that works, and now I want to make it roll and tumble. There's a few steps to get this looking just right. First, I'm going to create a motion path using the curve. You can also use the scribble, but I find the curve to be a little bit smoother. So let's make it fall from above, bounce, tumble, and then come to a rest here. And by default, it's going to say when the timeline starts on the die, but we need to say when the user clicks on the die, this should happen. And as you can see, this looks pretty crap because right now it doesn't actually tumble. So the next thing I'm going to do is in my path options, I'm going to select orient to path. Okay, that's better. Now the die actually looks like it's tumbling, but it still doesn't look that great. So let me shorten the duration a bit. That looks a little bit better. You might have to play with your exact duration and your exact motion path, which you can redraw until you're 100% happy with it. So once you're happy with your duration and the path itself, one thing that's really annoying is that this die doesn't look like it's coming to a rest here. And to fix that, we're going to need a little bit of a magic trick. So I'm going to copy this die and I'm going to call this new die resting die. Let's remove the motion path from this resting die and let's set it down right here. So this resting die is going to start out invisible. And once the moving die finishes rolling, I'm going to make the moving die disappear and I'm going to make the resting die appear at the same time. So we're swapping them out. So this resting die's initial state is hidden. And then I say change the moving die to hidden when the motion path finishes. And I'm going to change the resting die to be visible at the exact same time. So I'm just swapping the dice. Obviously, I want to make sure that this resting die will have the right value. So change it to 1 if the die roll is 1, change it to 2 if the die roll is 2, and so on to 6. Now when I test this, there's this little delay at the end that I don't really like. So I'm just going to move my resting die a bit, and now that looks better. And that's it. That's all you need to make your rolling die. So now you've seen 5 reusable game ingredients that you can easily build in Storyline. But do not fall in love with one of them and try to make your content fit with it. Always figure out what your learning objectives need first, and then pull out the ingredients that you need if and when they serve that objective. And if you want the full method to build gamified e-learning that learners love and that makes a visible real-world impact, you can book a call below and join my program. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.